Well, I know I just mentioned it a minute ago, but we have started the stream, our live stream, and I know that he'll be watching. So, Dad, happy birthday to you. I've already mentioned it here, but I want to tell you happy birthday. And I want to publicly say thank you for being an example of what a godly man should be. It means a lot to have known you all these years, and I appreciate and love you very much. We are continuing this morning with our series that I've entitled Conviction, as we're looking at Paul as he's been arrested. In fact, from this point on, Paul's, as far as we know, is never going to be free again. He's going to be a prisoner of the Roman Empire. Now, there is some evidence in some places, or some people hold that maybe he did get some freedom later and even traveled as far as Spain, but for the most part we have no definitive evidence of that. But we're working through the last chapters of the Acts of the Apostles and talking through these things that are happening to Paul in this series that we've entitled Conviction. Today we're going to continue to wrap up the 22nd chapter and now get into the 23rd chapter and the events starting next week that we haven't looked at all in our series over the last few years. Last week we took time to recap the series we've done over the last few years and the journey we've taken through Acts and the story that's set up here for us in 22 and then 23 through 28. So our scripture this morning comes from Acts 22, verse 22, and it's going to continue through Acts 23, verse 11. We will read from the New King James Version this morning, and you can find that in pew Bibles in front of you or in your bulletins. And you can also read whatever version you have actually brought with you, but follow along as we read these words. And they listened to him until this word. And then they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he is not fit to live." Then, as they cried out and tore off their clothes and threw dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks and said that he should be examined under scourging, so that he might know why they shouted so against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard that, he went and told the commander, saying, "Take care what you do, for this man is a Roman." Then the commander came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" He said, "Yes." The commander answered, "With a large sum I obtained this citizenship." And Paul said, "But I was born a citizen." Then immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him, and the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. The next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear and brought Paul down and set him before them. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, "Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. And Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law. And do you command me to be struck contrary to the law?" And those who stood by said, "Do you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people.'" But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other part Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." And when he had said this, a dissension rose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there rose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, "We find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God." Now when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him into the barracks. But the following night the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul. For as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness in Rome." May God bless the reading of his word. Lord, we come and we read this story. We read about Paul being convicted, but we read about Paul's great conviction for you. And Lord, may we see through this story today that through the trials of life that you are always with us. And in the midst of the dissension and the trouble of this world, that you bring us hope. In Jesus' name, amen. Last week, as we were going through and we were looking at Paul, and Paul was sharing his story, and he was speaking to this big crowd in the temple courts and stuff, we looked at a couple things. We looked at, what's your story? Paul's telling his story. Our stories matter. What God has done in our lives. And Paul told a story of this. Here is my life before I knew him. I didn't know Jesus. I persecuted Jesus. Then I met Jesus. Then Jesus changed who I was, and this is what I did for Jesus after that. And our stories are very similar. We don't know Jesus. We meet Jesus. We understand who Jesus is. It changes our lives, and nothing is ever the same afterwards. Now, it's interesting. A lot of times we like to tell the story and say, once we meet Jesus, everything was wonderful and great. But in Paul's situation, doesn't mean everything was wonderful and great. In fact, we're going to see Paul's giving this great story of I met Jesus, and guess what? It's going to get worse for me. People are going to try to stone me, try to kill me because I want to follow Jesus. But yet Paul says, this is my story. Makes me want to sing. This is my story. This is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. And Paul said, that's what I'm going to do. And then the other question we asked last week is, who is included? Who's included in this great story that is being told? And the answer is everybody. Everybody. And in fact, Paul, at the very end of last week, we hear, he says, I've been called to go to the Gentiles. And that's when it all erupts. That's when it all goes wrong, when he says, I am going to the Gentiles. Now, this week, the question is a real simple one. Where do you belong? Where do you belong? Where is home? Where is that place that gives you comfort? Where is that place where you should be with your life, where I should be with my life? So we pick up the story. They listened to him until he said the word Gentiles. And as soon as he said Gentiles, they said, and these are the Jewish people who are gathered in the temple areas, away with him. He is not fit to live. Anybody who says that God's word is for the entire world, that the gospel is for everybody, is not fit to live. It's just for us. And this great dissension arose, and it tells us they cried out. They tore off their clothes. They threw dust up in the air. There's all these things going, and the commander comes out of the Antonia fortress, which we've looked at the Temple Mount, and we've seen where it's at on the one corner. And Herod had built this, and it had the Roman soldier's house in it. And he orders that Paul be brought into the barracks. He says, stop this riot. Go get him. I need to talk to him. And this commander's got to think, man, this is nuts what's going on out here. These people are going nuts because they hate the Gentiles. Guess what? I'm one of them. I'm a Gentile. And these people are going nuts because they hate me. And so bring this man in. And from this moment on, Paul remains in custody to the very end of the book of Acts. And he brings him in, and then he says this. He doesn't say, let's go ask the crowd what's going on. He says, let's scourge this man so that we can know why they're shouting against him. Instead of asking the people who are actually shouting, let's just beat this man and see if he gives us. And this isn't your normal scourging. This is going to be Roman scourging. This is going to be where they're going to tie his hands, and they're going to up high, and they're going to get the nastiest. I don't even want to go into descriptions, but it's the nastiest, ugliest whip that you could ever imagine. And they're going to beat him with it. And there's great history of the fact that when you get beaten with this Roman whip, when you're scourged, you die. We've always heard the legends about, they would only beat a man 39 times because they knew if they hit him 40 times he would die. The Romans didn't have any limits on how many times they would scourge somebody. And so they're going to go and they're going to do this, and he's going to be examined. And it was very, very common in those days, but it was only done to people who were not Roman citizens. Now, citizenship was a lot different in those days than what we have now. Not everybody was a citizen of the Roman Empire who was born there. In fact, citizenship was a very, very small percentage of the people who were part of the Roman Empire. And these people had certain civil rights, and they had certain things that prevented them from being whipped and being beaten. And even as I'm about to tell you, that I'm going to tell you now, it prevented them from even being tied up and bound. If you were a Roman citizen, you couldn't. And so here we go in verse 25. And as they bound him with thongs, they tied him up. Paul said to the Roman centurion who was standing there, "Hey, got a question for you. Is it legal to scourge a Roman citizen who's not even been condemned?" Now this scared this centurion. And the centurion was probably not a Roman citizen himself, but he knew the rules of the day. And he's tied with this leather and his hands behind his back. And Paul says, "Wait a minute, let me remind you of something that he's not said before. I'm a Roman citizen." Paul is a unique, incredible person. He was uniquely fit for the mission that God called him for, because Paul was a Jew. He was raised Jewish. He spoke Hebrew. He spoke Aramaic. And at the same time, he was a Roman citizen. And very few Jews were ever Roman citizens. And it probably was something, Paul's going to tell us here in the story, that he was a Roman citizen by birth. And it's probably something that either his father did or his grandfather did to help out the Roman Empire, to help out some proconsul or somebody in the empire, and they granted citizenship to this family. Paul is uniquely, strongly educated. He's educated in Greek history, Greek philosophy, Roman history, Roman philosophy. But he's a Jew through and through in who he is. He's a unique character in the history of the world with all of this background, and he is one who is uniquely fitted to take the gospel to Jew and to Gentile. God takes people where they are and says, "This is who you are. This is how you're gifted. This is who I've made you to be. And if you will let me, I will use the way I've made you for specific roles, specific tasks to make a difference in the world." And one person's role in life is different from another person's role in life. And yet in the sight of God, they all have value and worth. And Paul was uniquely situated, but he looks at this guy who's tying him up and getting ready to beat him, and says, "Hey, did you know I'm a Roman citizen?" This guy's scared. The centurion heard that. He went and told the commander and said, "Be careful. This guy's a Roman. This guy's a Roman citizen. It's a serious violation of Roman rights to even tie up a Roman citizen. In fact, if you violate a Roman citizen's rights, you can be put to death for doing that." So now the centurion's life is on the line. The commander's life is on the line. And he goes and says, "Commander, don't do anything. This guy says he's a Roman." Now it's interesting here, Paul wasn't traveling with any papers. He wasn't traveling with anything that says, "I'm a Roman citizen." He said it by word. But the thing is, in those days, if you lied about being a Roman citizen, it was death. People told the truth about whether or not they were Roman citizens. Now, in our day and time, we've changed so much that, we'll just tell a little white lie. "Yeah, I'm a Roman citizen. It's okay. It's okay. Oh, I don't have my papers with me today. I'll get them for you, bring them to you later." But in those days, if you told the lie, if there was any way to show that it was a lie, you would die. Commander came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" The penalty was significant, but the verbal claim to Roman citizenship was always accepted at face value. And so he looks at it, and Paul looks at him, and he says, "Yes, I'm a Roman citizen." Now the commander says something that's really interesting. Commander answered and he says, "With a large sum I obtained this citizenship." So the commander says, "Hey, I'm a Roman citizen too, but I paid for it." Now, it's really interesting because for the most part, you couldn't buy Roman citizenship. You could do it through a bribe sometimes. And the commander's saying, "I did this," and he's going, "It might have cost me a lot, and maybe Maybe that's just become so cheap that it's so easy to become a Roman citizen. He's looking at Paul and he's been dragged around and he looks awful and he's been through prison and he's all this and he's looking at him and going, this guy doesn't look like anybody who'd be a Roman citizen. Maybe he just got it real cheap on the side somewhere. Maybe it doesn't mean anything anymore to be a Roman citizen. And Paul looked at him and said, I was born a citizen. I didn't pay for this. Somebody else paid the cost for me. Paul's going to say the same thing about the kingdom of God, isn't he? Somebody else paid the cost for me. I was born into it. Paul's parents or grandparents must have been awarded the rights of citizenship for something good they had done at some point in time. We have no way of knowing what it is, but here is Paul, this uncommon, rare combination of citizen, Jew, everything. And the commander becomes afraid after this. And the commander is actually becoming concerned for his own safety and his own health because of what's been there. And immediately those who were about to examine him, and remember how were they going to examine him? They were going to examine him by scourge. In other words, those who were about to beat Paul almost to death withdrew from him. In other words, they got the heck out of there. They're like, we're not touching this. We have no desire to die. And the commander was also afraid because Paul was a Roman and he was responsible for having him tied up. So the next day, which means they threw Paul into prison overnight, the commander went back and going, oh, what do I do? What do I do? Next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, this time he's not going to find out from Paul. He's not going to go and beat Paul until he tells him why. He's going to go and he's going to have Paul released and command that the chief priests and their council appear. And he brings Paul and sets him before him. And he says, you know what? I'm actually going to go to the people who wanted to do this and ask them why. And I'm going to put Paul in front of them. Now, Paul, if you'll remember in the story, when Paul went up and he had this great chance to speak, and before all this erupted, Paul's thinking, man, I got this great chance to tell people about Jesus. And because of who I am, because I speak to them in their own language, they're going to listen to this story about Jesus. And Paul had been so excited, and then suddenly the people just turned on him. And he's in jail. Well, here comes the commander, and he says, guess what, Paul? I'm going to put you in front of the high priest. I'm going to put you in front of the Sanhedrin, the council, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all these people together. And Paul's got to be going in his mind, I got another chance to tell them about Jesus. And I'm going to tell the leaders about Jesus. I was thinking about this in light of things we used to do. One of the things when I lived in Madagascar, and we've done this in other places, is I had the opportunity to do things where I could go and work with a basketball team. And that was nice. And I got to work with 10, 12, 15 people. But in other places, I had the chance where I got to go work with basketball coaches. And I'd work with 50 basketball coaches and teach them things about the game, but also teach things about Christ and stuff. And because I got to work with them, they went back and each worked with 10, 12, 15, 20 athletes. And suddenly that little work with that leadership for me expanded to work with 1,000 people. Because if you can work with those who are working with others, if you can help them. And Paul's going, I got the council. If I can get the council to see Jesus, it'll spread to everybody. We'll start with these people who have influence over everybody else, and we'll do this. And so that's what we're going to do. It's interesting, too, because it kind of gives us the idea that this commander that's here for this Roman commander might have been kind of a fair man in some ways. He's going, I need you guys to explain why you want to do this. I want to actually hear the story. And he said, maybe there's something concrete there that will mean Paul forfeited his citizenship. And Paul's going, I got a chance to speak through the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Congress, and I'm going to convince them about Jesus. And when I convince them, this group that, by the way, Paul was once a member of. This is confirmed for us again in Acts 26. We'll see it. Paul was once part of the Sanhedrin. He had a vote on the Jewish council at one. What a unique character this guy is. All the way through. And he gets there and he's like, I get to talk to him. He says, I might even recognize some of them. Hadn't been involved with him for 20 years because he's been out, doing gospel things. But he's like, maybe I'll see some of them. Some of these will be the guys who sent me out to kill the Christians all these years ago. I'm going to talk to them. And so he sets Paul before him. And Paul looks earnestly at them, and he says this, men and brothers. See, normally when people would sit before this, they'd look and go, rulers of the people and elders of Israel. But Paul said, men and brothers. He said, we are equal. He put himself on the same plane with each of them. He didn't say, you're the rulers of the people. You are the rulers of Israel, the elders of Israel. He said, men and brothers. Here we are together. We've gathered. And I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. Paul didn't say, I'm not a sinner. Paul didn't say, I am perfect. But Paul said, I am here in good conscience today because I know I've got it right with God. And as soon as he said that, the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by to strike him in the mouth. Paul probably thought it was an innocent way to begin his preaching, not thinking sinlessly perfect, or that he had never been wrong. He just says, whenever I've done wrong, whenever I've done it, I've come to God. And he said, I came to God, and I have great conscience about what I'm here today and about what God has done. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4:4, for I know nothing against myself, yet I am not justified by this, but he who judges me is the Lord. Paul's saying, God's got me, and he knows who I am, and I know who God is, and I am here in good conscience with my brothers today. And Ananias has him struck in the mouth. There's one of two reasons. Either this, Ananias thought, Paul, you're a liar. You're a liar because everything you've done has created all these problems and all these dissensions, and you are not in good conscience. I'm going to have you struck in the mouth. Or Ananias looked at Paul and was so convicted that Paul's integrity was correct that he couldn't stand it, and he had no way to respond to it other than to have Paul hit. When we get down to where we have no other words, where we're so frustrated, where we can't handle it, we just lash out against the one who's speaking. And no matter what it was, this order is totally illegal. For Jewish law says, and Ananias is the high priest at this time, he who strikes the cheek of one Israelite strikes as it were the glory of God. He that strikes a man strikes the Holy One. And so Ananias, the one who's supposed to uphold the law, breaks the very law and has Paul, a fellow Israelite, struck. Now Ananias is an interesting creature, person, whatever you want to call him in the histories of time. He was one who was known very much for his greed. He was high priest for his own personal gain. And the historian Josephus actually tells us that Ananias stole for himself the tithes and stuff that would come in for the priest, for the common priest, and take it. And actually Ananias, and it's really interesting what Paul's about to say here, Ananias is actually going to be brutally killed by a bunch of Jewish nationalists before too long. He's going to be just so reviled by other Israelites, other Jewish people, that they're actually going to revolt against him and kill him. And here's what Paul said. Paul said to him, and it's interesting, we don't know how Paul said these words. There's a couple ways Paul could have said this. He could have said, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? He could have lashed back at him. Listen, Paul wasn't always calm, cool, and collected. Paul had a little hot side to him, and if you read the scriptures and if you read some of the things, Paul had a nice little sarcastic side to him also. He was very human. Or he might have sat there and just been calm as could be and looked at him and said, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? We don't know if Paul lashed at him or if Paul was just confident and said, you know what, God's going to judge you. But either way, he says this, God will strike you. and Ananias is going to be killed by his own people. The rebuke to Ananias is accurate and justified. The man who commanded that this defenseless man be punched in the face was indeed what we would call a whitewashed wall. In other words, it's just a white finish over something that's really ugly underneath, and it was really ugly. The men of the council are supposed to be examples of the law of Moses, and the command was contrary to the spirit and the letter of the law, and Paul's words were incredibly prophetic. But those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? Wait a minute, Paul, you're talking to the high priest. This is God's. And Paul said, and again, this is one I really wish we knew how it was said. What was his tone of voice? We can't get it from here. He says, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. And then there's so many possibilities here. He may not have actually known. Paul hasn't been involved with the council for 20 years. He may not have known Ananias was the high priest at this point in time. Ananias may not have been on the council with Paul 20 years ago. He may not have known. There are some people who say, there is some evidence in the Bible that Paul may have had problems with vision. And he may not have actually seen who gave the order. Maybe he didn't know. It could also be a very sarcastic. I didn't know, brethren, that he was a high priest. High priest would never act like that, now would he? We don't know how it was said. But Paul says this, and Paul knows immediately after this that he's wrong in his reaction. Because Scripture tells him that, and it comes all the way from Exodus, that it is wrong to speak evil of the ruler of your people. And Paul's actually going to have some regret over his outburst here, his response to him. And because Paul's going to understand that even though this man did this, I still have to follow what God has said. And so Paul's there, and all of a sudden he realizes these people are never going to listen to what I have to say about Jesus today. They're not going to listen. And so Paul's going to change his tactic totally in verse 6. When Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cries out, Brethren, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. He realized that this Sanhedrin, this council of people who really don't get along, disagree with each other all the time, are just united together against the common enemy of Paul, which means they're really united against the common enemy, which is Jesus, as they have been from the beginning. They're coming together, and Paul says, you know what, I see what this audience is. They're not going to be open to the gospel. There's nothing I'm going to do. Now, God, he's not going to worry about preaching the gospel. He's like, how can I get out of this? Well, what's one way to get out of it? You're in the midst of something, get that side to start fighting with this side. And then they're going to get their attention off of you, and they're going to start putting it on each other a little bit over there. Get those Democrats and Republicans fighting with each other, and they're going to leave you alone because they're going to be out of the way. And that's what he's going to do right here. And he says, by the way, I'm a Pharisee. And let me give you an issue. I'm the son of a Pharisee. So we learn more about Paul and who he was. And I believe, and what I'm here about, is about the resurrection of the dead. And that's what I'm being judged for. Which is really true. It's really true. Paul's like, I'm here because Jesus Christ was resurrected from the dead. And because he's resurrected from the dead, I have life that is eternal. And it's interesting because one part of this were Pharisees, and he's going to divide them among their party lines. He's going to get the Pharisees to be sympathetic to him, and the Sadducees not. Now they're going to fight against him. And he goes after this because he understands that the Pharisees actually believe. They actually believe that there's a resurrection, that there's a life that's coming. They believe in angels. They believe in all these other things. And the Sadducees didn't believe it at all. And so they start arguing among themselves. For the Sadducees, a dissension arose. I meant to pick out that verse. And when he said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And when we talk about dissensions, this isn't just arguing and shouting back and forth. There's some pushing and some shoving. There's all kinds of stuff going on. And the assembly was divided because the Sadducees say there is no There is no resurrection from the dead. The Sadducees were the theological liberals of their day. They denied the reality of life after death, the concept of resurrection, and that there is no resurrection, no angel, no spirits. And the Pharisees were on the other side of the thing, and they were going to find some agreement because they were more Bible believers in the Jewish world at the time, and they took the Scriptures a little more seriously than the Sadducees did, although they erred also by adding way too much regulation to it and going on. And they were usually bitter enemies anyhow. They united against Jesus in Matthew 16, and in John 11 they united against Paul here, but most of the time they were arguing with each other. And the Pharisees get up and they hearken back to Gamaliel, which we talked about at an earlier time, and they said, "We find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or angel has spoken to him, let's not fight against God." And the Pharisees are going, "Well, if you're fighting against what he says, you're fighting against us. And if you're fighting against us, you're fighting against God." And the Sadducees are going, "Hey, we don't know your God. We know a different God." And they start fighting back. And this dissension gets bigger, and it grows a great dissension. And the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them. This is not a dissension of, "Oh, yeah? Well, I'll tell you this. Oh, yeah? Well, my mom says this. Oh, yeah?" No, this man. And they're pulling on Paul, and they're doing all this. And the commander says, "Go get him out of there and take him back to the Antonia fortress. Take him back, stick him in the barracks." Now, Paul is later, in Acts 24, which we'll see in 2 weeks, Paul is going to say that what he did here was not good. Paul's going to take some responsibility and say, "I created a controversy I shouldn't have created. It was wrong on my part to do what I did." See, Paul's issue was this. Paul had this incredible love and passion for the people of Israel. We have 2 instances here in 22 and 23 where all he really wanted to do was just share the gospel. He wanted to share it with the people. He wanted to share it with the leaders. But nobody wanted to hear what he had to say. And sometimes we just want to share the gospel. If you only knew how much Jesus loved you. If you only knew, it would make all the difference. And people don't want to hear it. Paul had this passion for the people of Israel. In fact, in Romans, he's going to write, "I tell the truth in Christ. I am not lying. My conscience also bearing me witness in the Holy Spirit, that I have great sorrow and continual grief in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my countrymen, according to the flesh, who are Israelites." He says, "I would give up heaven itself and be cursed by Christ. I would accept hell if my brethren, the Israelites, would find heaven and find Jesus." I was listening to one guy talk about this. He said, he was talking to his congregation. He said, "I don't love you guys that much." He says, "I don't love you enough to give up heaven and go to hell so that you can go to heaven." He said, "I'm on the let's all go to heaven plan." And I like that plan. But Paul said, "I'll give it all up if my brothers and sisters and my countrymen would find Jesus and go to heaven." And so Paul now is alone in this barracks, and he has got to be devastated. He's in prison. He's almost been beaten to death. He's almost been torn apart by his own people, and he's not been able to share the gospel like he wants to. It is this dissension that is just ripping his heart apart, and he is in pain, and he is in agony. And verse 11 tells us, "But the following night, the Lord stood by him." Most scholars will tell you they think this is an actual physical manifestation of Jesus with Paul. That Jesus literally stood by him. Now let me tell you what it doesn't say here. It doesn't say the Lord rescued him. It doesn't say the Lord delivered him out of his situation. It just means he stood beside him. It had to be difficult. his heart longing for the salvation of his people. He's blaming himself because of the opportunity he's missed and the dissension that he's put there. He could be crying, mourning all the opportunities that are there. And the Lord stood by him, and then he said this, Tharseo. It's one word in Greek. Tharseo. Paul. First of all, he called him by name. In the midst of his agony, in the midst of his grief, Jesus knew who Paul was and called him by name. And he uses one word, Tharseo, which is translated, be of good cheer. I think it's kind of cool that in the Greek it only takes one word to say all four of those things right there. Be of good cheer. Paul, no matter how bad it is, be encouraged. The words that Paul needed, because Paul knew his situation was bad, and he didn't even know the half of it. History's going to tell us the next day 40 Jewish assassins are going to gather together and vow to go on a hunger strike until they murder Paul. Paul doesn't even know this is coming. Now, Jesus knows. And yet he's still standing there with Paul, and he says, be in good cheer. You think bad right now? It might get worse. Be of good cheer, Paul, because all things are going to work together for good to those who love God and for those who are called according to his purpose. Paul's going to write later in Romans again. Anyone can be of good cheer when everything is great, but the Christian can be of good cheer when everything is rotten going, that God is mighty and God is wonderful. And no matter what the crisis or moment is, Jesus is there with us in it. This word, tharseo, is used 5 times in the New Testament. Each time it is used by Jesus. Jesus told the bedridden paralytic, son, be of good cheer, your sins are forgiven, in Matthew. Jesus told the woman with 12 years of bleeding, Tharseo, be of good cheer, your faith has made you well. Jesus told his frightened disciples on the Sea of Galilee, in the midst of the storm, be of good cheer, it is I. Jesus told his disciples the night before his crucifixion, in this world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. Jesus used this word over and over in significant places in the New Testament. And then Jesus says this, be of good cheer, Paul, for you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome. Hey, guess what, Paul? I'm not done with you. You may not think you've done anything in these last couple days, but you've testified for me right here in front of these people. And somewhere in those crowds and somewhere in that Pharisaic council and the Sanhedrin, and people are going to remember what you said, and it's going to make an impact whether you ever know it or not. And guess what, Paul? Whatever you think they're trying to do with you, I'm not done. You got to go to Rome. You got to go to Rome. Remember when I told you can't go to Ephesus, and then later I sent you into Ephesus? Now I'm telling you, you're not done here either. You got to go to Rome. So you be discouraged about the lack of results here, but you understand that I am not done. You have testified for me. And Paul, I'm telling you, you did the right stuff here in Jerusalem. Because they acted that way doesn't mean what you did was wrong. You stood up for me. And you must bear witness for me at Rome. And so when he goes the next day and he's going to face all these people, Paul's going to go with a new thing. He's going to go, guess what? I still got Jesus. And guess what? We ain't done. And there's nothing you can do to me here in Jerusalem because God's sending me to Rome. And so we're going to keep on keeping on. And this divine decree ordains for you greater and more trying service. Jesus didn't say to him, oh, by the way, it's going to get really hard over there too. He just said, you're going on. You're going to keep going, and you must bear witness. And it's a promise of continued protection for Paul because he had to live until he finished everything that God had given him to do. This timing and this promise was especially precious because for Paul, he didn't think he's going to get out of Jerusalem alive. And God not only knows what we need to hear, he knows when we need to hear it. And he's saying to him, Paul, you're getting out of Jerusalem alive. Don't worry about it. We got more to do. And it brought great comfort. And the next day, Paul probably had a smile on his face. No matter what they were saying, he's like, yeah, God's got me. I'm good. And the question is, where do we belong? That we started with today? In the heart of the trials, where do we belong? We belong in the company of Jesus. Because in the company of Jesus, no matter the dissension and the trials of this world, there is comfort and there is hope. And Paul was completely and totally convicted of that. Lord, we thank you that we could read again this story. And as Paul heads towards Rome, and as we look at all that's going to transpire there, Lord, may we find the comfort that he found in knowing that you are with us and that you know us by name. And no matter what the trials of life bring, you have plans for us. Lord, may that bring us comfort, hope, and joy. In Jesus' name, amen. We're going to close with a song. I think we've done it just recently again, but I want to do it again. We'll do the first and last verse, and it simply says this: wherever he leads, I'll go. Paul said that. Okay, you want me to go to Rome? I'm going. Let's go. Let's do the first one.
Please, 285, first and last verse.